needs to stop. A final word on the operations of the State Department itself. The department must refocus itself on the core mission of effective diplomacy. Every program, office, and policy at state must effectively advance U.S. foreign policy goals, not advance progressive ideology. The outgoing administration often undercut effective foreign policy by inserting ideological and political requirements into the fabric of personnel decisions and policy execution. Rather than making hires or promotions based on merit and effectiveness, the department created a new diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility requirements that distracted from this mission, undermined morale, and created an unfair and opaque process for promotions and performance evaluations. Fealty to progressive politics became the benchmark for success. As we look around the United States, that view is diminishing very quickly amongst even large corporations, amongst even large progressive-leaning corporations. Adherence to these goals was assured at the State Department through a rigid enforcement structure that included senior advisors for DEIA in nearly every bureau and Soviet-style anonymous reporting portals where employees were encouraged to denounce colleagues who would not toe the company line. This must end on day one. We need a return to merit, and I know Marco will right that ship. Senator Rubio, this is a long laundry list of crises. You've earned yourself one of the hardest jobs in America, but after serving with you for so many years, I'm confident you are the right person we need to take on these threats. Thank you very much. And to my good friend, Senator Shaheen, I yield the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Risch. Congratulations on your new role. As you point out, while this may be our first Foreign Relations Committee hearing together in these new roles, it's certainly not our first time working together. We came in as governors, so we like to get things done. We've also had the same role in 2017 on the Small Business Committee. So I look forward to working with you and to our opportunity for this committee to get a lot of work done. I want to also congratulate the new members of the committee, Republicans McCormick, Daines, Scott, Lee, Curtis, and Cornyn. And on the Democratic side, Jackie Rosen. Nice to have you all on the committee. One point that we've always agreed on, the chairman and I, is the need to work together so this committee can function more effectively. That means holding hearings, it means advancing bipartisan legislation, it means confirming career foreign service officers quickly. I believe it's in our national security interest to have our embassies fully staffed and to confirm career ambassadors with the requisite expertise, which is why it was important to both of us to have Senator Rubio's hearing as soon as possible. And Senator Rubio, welcome. You and I have also had a good working relationship for many years. I believe you have the skills and are well qualified to serve as Secretary of State. But today I want to find out a little more about what this administration is thinking about American foreign policy and the State Department in particular. As I said, I believe this committee has a responsibility to get your team out in the field, and we hope you will send us qualified, experienced, and well-vetted nominees. I know you already have an expert group of career foreign service nominees before you that was not considered under the last Congress. I hope we'll see many of those nominees resubmitted to this committee soon. On policy, I want to start by hearing from you on Ukraine and NATO. There is strong bipartisan support, as you know, in the Senate for Ukraine. There's a clear understanding that we can't trust Putin, and I'm concerned that if Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine, he's not going to stop. President Trump has repeatedly said that he plans to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours of his inauguration. It's been reported that his proposals would give away Ukrainian territory to Vladimir Putin. Now, I can't speak on behalf of Ukraine, and President Zelensky has said that he's open to a peace agreement. But I am concerned both for the Ukrainian people who have sacrificed so much about the message that abandoning Ukraine would send not just to our allies, but also to our adversaries, and not just Russia, but to China, North Korea, and Iran. Our allies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Our partnerships and alliances like AUKUS and NATO are all looking very closely and watching what we're going to do. I believe these alliances are one of the United States' greatest assets. And what happens in Ukraine also affects emerging democratic nations, civil society movements, from Belarus to the Balkans to the Black Sea to Georgia. It impacts us here at home as well. And I know that for so many Americans, this might seem like a distant war. But as we know, what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. The war has caused food and gas prices to go up. It's affected day-to-day lives of Americans. So, Senator Rubio, I know that in the past you've supported Ukraine. You introduced legislation that would ban U.S. recognition of territory annexed by Russia. We were both co-sponsors of Chairman Rish's resolution recognizing Russian genocide in Ukraine. But the path forward is uncertain, and I hope today you will lay out some of the administration's plans for Ukraine. I'd also like to hear from you on the Middle East and Syria in particular. In recent months, we've seen the dismantling of much of Iran's axis of resistance, including the fall of Assad, one of Iran's most brutal proxies. One of our goals should be to get humanitarian assistance immediately to the Syrian people who have suffered for so many years, and to capitalize on this historic opportunity to sideline not only Iran, but Russia as we help rebuild Syria. I also want to underline that whether it's food insecurity or sexual violence that accompanies war, and whether we're talking about Sudan or Haiti or Afghanistan, Ukraine or Gaza, that it is women who often bear the brunt of these conflicts. They should have a seat at the table when it comes to resolving them. And that's not just a sentiment, it's also backed up by data. Because we know that when women participate in conflict negotiations, peace is 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. That's why we passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act in 2017. It was signed into law by President Trump during his first term, and I hope that in his second term, we can build on this effort. It's one of the reasons I'm pleased that we now have 3 women on the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Duckworth and Senator Rosen. It's the first time since I've been here that there's been 3 women on this committee. And I'm interested to hear your vision for the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues, and more broadly, how the administration will work to empower women and girls on the global stage. As Chairman Risch has said, the list of challenges facing America is very long. And so, Senator Rubio, if you're confirmed, I hope we can work together to continue to promote American interests that we have seen around the world the importance of America's role in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Good remarks. Senator Rubio, the floor is going to be yours, and I hope you'll introduce your beautiful family to start with, and we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you, Chairman Risch, and I want to thank the ranking member as well, Senator Shaheen, and thank you, Senator Scott, for your introduction. And let me just say it's a bit surreal to be on this side of the room, but you all look very distinguished. And I wanted you to know that.
Yeah. We
Right.
know that.
In the 249-year history of our republic, there's only been 71 other Americans who have served in the role and the position that President Trump has now nominated me to occupy. And I want to thank him for his confidence. And it's an incredible honor. It is also, as many of you have already pointed out, an extraordinary responsibility. 3 of my children, Amanda, Anthony, and Dominic, could not be here with us today or join us here in person. But I am happy that my wife, Jeanette, is here, and that my daughter, Daniela, is here with me as well, because I think, as each of you know well, it really is impossible to do our job in the Senate, not to mention the job I've been nominated for, without the love and the support of our families. I'm also very pleased that my sisters, Barbara and Veronica, and my nephew, Orlando, are joining me here today. And to me, it's a reminder that the path that brings me to this moment was paved by those who are not here with us today, by 2 parents who arrived here on May 27th of 1956 from Cuba, and they had nothing but the dreams of a better life. And because of them, I had the privilege to be born a citizen of the greatest nation in the history of mankind and to be raised in a safe and stable home by parents who made their children's future the very purpose of their lives. I also want to acknowledge all the blessings that God has bestowed upon me in my life. My faith is critical and it's something I will lean and rely on heavily in the months that are ahead. In a tumultuous world where, in my faith, we are called to promote the cause of peace and the common good. And that task has gotten harder than it's ever been. And I will rely heavily on my faith and pray for God's blessings, that He will provide me the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to do what is right in these tenuous moments. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was, in the words of then Secretary of State, tasked with creating an order, a world order, a free half, as he quote in his quote, out of chaos, without blowing to pieces, without blowing the whole of the world into pieces in the process. And in the decades that followed, that global order served us quite well. Americans' incomes rose and communities flourished. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and Europe that led to the emergence of stability and democracy and prosperity in these regions.
We've had forever war ever since. Little Marco, keep your hands.
Back to order.
All right, alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe that led to the emergence of stability, democracy, and prosperity, but it also prevented a cataclysmic world war. And ultimately, a wall in Berlin came down, and with it, an evil empire. Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals. An irrational zeal for maximum freedom of movement of people has resulted in a historic mass migration crisis here in America, but also around the world. It's one that threatens the stability of societies and of governments. Across the West, governments now censor and even prosecute domestic political opponents. Meanwhile, radical jihadists openly march in the streets and sadly drive vehicles into our people. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries always have.
Las sanciones de Marco Rubio están
Pause.
matando a niños en Nicaragua, Cuba y Venezuela.
Back to order.
I get bilingual protests, which is, I think, is an entry cool.
As you know, that's a first here for us, at least in recent times.
All right.
Is a human right.
All right.
Education is a human right. Sanctions against
Back to order.
All right. So while America too often prioritized the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way nations have always acted and always will in what they perceive to be their best interest. And instead of folding into the post-Cold War global order, they have manipulated it to serve their interests at the expense of ours. We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country. In our very own hemisphere, Narco-terrorists and dictators and despots take advantage of open borders to drive mass migration, to traffic in women and children, and to flood our communities with deadly fentanyl and violent criminals. In Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, dictators, rogue states now sow chaos and instability and align with and they fund radical terror groups. And then they hide behind their veto power at the United Nations Security Council or the threats of nuclear war. The post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us. And all this has led to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and of generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive and in this room today. 8 decades later, we are once again called to create a free world out of the chaos. And this will not be easy. And it will be impossible without a strong and a confident America that engages in the world, putting our core national interests once again above all else. Just 4 years ago, I believe we began to see the outlines and the beginnings of what that would look like. During President Trump's first term, American strength was a deterrent to our adversaries, and it gave us leverage in diplomacy. There were no new wars. ISIS was eviscerated. Soleimani was dead. The historic Abraham Accords were born, and Americans were safer as a result. Now, President Trump returns to office with an unmistakable mandate from the voters. They want a strong America engaged in the world, but guided by a clear objective to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise that President Trump was elected to keep. And if I am confirmed, keeping that promise will be the core mission of the United States Department of State. Now, tragically, horrifying atrocities and unimaginable human suffering can be found on virtually every continent. And I am certain that today I will be asked about the array of programs and the activities the Department of State carries out to address them. We are a nation who was founded on the revolutionary truth that all men are created equal, and that our rights come not from man or from government, but from God. And so we will never be indifferent to the suffering of our fellow man. But ultimately, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States. The direction he has given for the conduct of our foreign policy is clear. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to one of 3 questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous? Under President Trump, the dollars of hardworking American taxpayers will always be spent wisely, and our power will always be yielded prudently and towards what is best for America and Americans before anything and everything else. Prudence in the conduct of foreign policy is not an abandonment of our values. It is the common sense understanding that while we remain the wealthiest and the most powerful nation on the earth, our wealth has never been unlimited, and our power has never been infinite. And placing our core national interest above all else is not isolationism. It is the common sense realization that a foreign policy centered in our national interest is not some outdated relic. Since the emergence of the modern nation state over 2 centuries ago, countries acting based on what they perceive to be their core national interest, that has been the norm, not the exception. And for our country, placing the interest of America and Americans above all else has never been more relevant or more necessary than it is right now. For in the end, how can America promote the cause of peace on earth if it is not first safe at home? What good is America to our allies if it is not strong? And how can America help end the suffering of God's children across the world if it is not first prosperous here at home? I thank you, and I hope I can earn your support, whether it's because you believe I will do a good job or because you want to get rid of me. Thank you.
Either way, the result's the same. Thank you, Senator Rubio. I've always been impressed with your view, particularly on a 50,000 foot level of the kind of problems that we face in our lane and national security lane, foreign relations and intelligence. So appreciate those remarks. We're now going to start a round. I'm going to allow 10-minute questions since this is a cabinet level position. That doesn't mean you have to use all 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes are there. And what I'm going to do in this hearing and what I'm going to do in future hearings is I will call on people based on seniority on the committee at the time the gavel goes down. And if you come after that, you'll be put in line after that, and we'll go down the list like that. In any event, with that, Senator Rubio, could you talk for a minute about the Russian energy reliance? I think all of us were impressed when the war started that the Europeans knew the necessity of cutting the cord with Russia on their reliance on Russian energy, which had developed since the Iron Curtain came down, all of us believing that Russia would behave itself, which turned out to be a very misplaced view. And now, with the war carrying on, it's going to end, obviously, at some point in time. There are voices in Europe saying, well, we can go back to using Russian energy. My view is that that's not reasonable and it's not appropriate. And indeed, I think that the fallout from this war is going to go on for generations. Your thoughts on the energy relationship between Europe and Russia in the future?
Well, I'm reminded, I believe back in 2018, then President Trump, on two occasions, once at the United Nations and I think another time at a NATO conference, pointed, for example, to Germany's reliance on Russian energy as a real vulnerability. And he was snickered at. I remember he was snickered at by the representatives of Germany at the United Nations. He turned out to be 100% correct. In fact, that reliance on Russian energy was a major loss of deterrence. Vladimir Putin, among his many calculations, one of the calculations he took in going in Ukraine was that the Europeans would complain, maybe they'd hit him with a couple sanctions, they'd write some strongly worded nasty letters about him, but ultimately would not be able to do anything effectively because of how much they depended on Russia. And in some cases continue to depend. I believe France is the third leading payer into Russian energy in the world, and I think a couple other countries in Europe follow right behind. So there's still a significant amount of dependence in that regard. And that dependence on Russian energy is a tremendous amount of leverage that Vladimir Putin holds on his neighbors in Europe. Now, there is some good news. I think, for example, I watched with great interest the German engineering marvel, where they've been able to, I think by the end of this year, after they waived permitting requirements, and within 9 months, we're able to open what is literally a floating LNG terminal to allow and receive exports, including from the United States and other places. So I do think you're seeing movement in Europe now to try to detangle itself from that level of dependence, but it remains a real vulnerability and a tremendous piece of leverage for Putin against his neighbors in the broader world. It's also a reminder, by the way, and I used to be guilty of saying this quite a bit, that the Russian GDP was the size of Italy's, not very large. I think one of the things we learned from this endeavor is that it's not just the size of the GDP, but what it's composed of. And the Russian GDP, while smaller than some other countries, is largely reliant on the production of raw materials, on the energy, on food production, fertilizer and the like. And these are critical components of national strength and a reminder of how important they are for us here domestically as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do think, too, we ought to acknowledge that the Europeans did a job that was well beyond their expectations the first winter. As they struggled through, they did really well as far as cutting the cord with Russia, being as how hard they were tied to that. Let's talk about AUKUS for a minute. There hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS. Well, there hasn't been much discussion about AUKUS really since the thing started. A lot of us have been pressing the administration to gear that up. It has not been forthcoming. I'd like to hear your thoughts on AUKUS, the importance thereof, and getting this thing moving as it was intended.
Well, one of the things we'll have to endeavor to see, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of this that relies on the Department of Defense and other entities in government. To the extent the Secretary of State and the Department of State is engaged, it's something that I think you're going to find very strong support for in this administration, because it's one of I think it's almost a blueprint in many ways of how we can create consortium-like partnership with nation states that are allied to us to confront some of these global challenges, be it in the defense realm, in the technology realm, in the critical minerals realm, in the sensitive technologies and critical technologies on, for example, artificial intelligence and advances in even quantum computing. This obviously is more defense related, but it's one example of how we can leverage the power of these partnerships with allies, 2-3 countries in some cases, broader in others, to reach outcomes and objectives, such as creating a geopolitical and strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So we'll have to look at that and to see what components of whatever impediments exist can be removed by the action of the Department of State. But it also reminds us that in many of these, very few of these global issues are entirely reliant on the Department of State, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense. We have a host of other government agencies, commerce in many cases, who also play a critical role in expediting and going through, for example, some of the lists of technologies that perhaps are not being transferred because they've been deemed as sensitive. But in the case of our strong and close allies, that's the point, right? Is that you want to be able to find yourself in a situation where you can accelerate partnership by making available to key allies these sensitive technologies that we wouldn't want to see in the hands or developed by an adversary or unaligned country.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Our view is aligned, particularly on the excluded technology list. These are our closest and most trusted allies. And unfortunately, the current administration has really been difficult to work with as far as getting through that excluded technology list. And I hope you'll help expedite that. Let me talk for a minute about the International Criminal Court. Look, as you know, we've got real problems there. The court originally was intended, at least from our point of view, to be a court that focused on international crimes that were committed by people from countries who did not have a robust democracy nor a robust judicial system that held its own people accountable for crimes. The court's gone beyond that, obviously. They are not only focusing on people who aren't accountable elsewhere, but they're also focusing on people who come from countries that solve their own problems, like the United States of America and like Israel. The most recent obvious thing that flowed from that was the indictment on the same day of Netanyahu plus a Hamas character. Any court that is a court of law has to be able to recognize good from bad. And when you try to indict two people and show some type of moral equivalency in that regard, they're just barking up the wrong tree. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to rein them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's done. The ICC has done tremendous damage to its global credibility. First of all, it is going after a non-member state on the claims that I believe. In fact, I think just in the last 24 hours, the Israeli High Court filed an appeal before the ICC, even though it's not a member state. And I saw some of the filings from the prosecutor. Mr. Khan was involved in that process, and he argues that they have the right to go after non-members for their activities within the confines of member states in this case. And I think, first of all, the whole premise of his prosecution is flawed beyond the process of it and the precedent that it sets, which is a very dangerous precedent for the United States of America, by the way, because this is a test run. This is a trial run to see, can we go after a head of state from a nation that's not a member? If we can go after them and we can get it done with regards to Israel, they will apply that to the United States at some point. And in fact, there have been threats to do so in the past. But the premise of the prosecution itself is completely and utterly flawed. As you said, they went ahead, I think they also went after Sinwar. Well, number one, Sinwar didn't travel around the world. He's not with us any longer, but he didn't travel around the world, was at no risk of being apprehended. Second of all, the moral equivalency piece of it was offensive. Let me explain, and I think I don't need to explain to this committee. Hamas carried out an atrocious operation. They sent a bunch of savages into Israel with the express and explicit purpose of targeting civilians. They went into concerts. They went into these music festivals. They knew that there were no soldiers at the music festival. They knew that these were teenagers and young families, that they went into different communities and the kibbutzes and the like, and they deliberately targeted civilians. Deliberately. It was in fact, they kidnapped the ones they didn't murder, the families who they didn't eviscerate, the people whose skulls they didn't crack open. They kidnapped, and to this day continue to hold people innocents that they took. A deliberate operation. In the case of Israel, responding to that attack has had to go after Hamas. How can you coexist? How can any nation state on the planet coexist side by side with a group of savages like Hamas? They have to defend their national security and their national interest, as I pointed out in my opening statement. And so there is no more, and they didn't target civilians. Now, sadly and unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further, some of the other questions that will come up here today, one of the horrible things about war, it's a terrible thing about war, and it's why we should try to prevent it at almost any cost, is that innocent people are caught up in it. And that's true of every conflict on the planet. But there is a difference between those who, in the conduct of armed action, deliberately target civilians, and those who do as much as they can to avoid civilians being caught up against an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, against an enemy that hides in tunnels, against an enemy that hides behind women and children, and puts them at the forefront and uses them as human shields. That's who Hamas is. There is no moral equivalency. And I think the ICC, if they don't drop this, will find its credibility globally badly damaged. And I think the United States should be very concerned, because I believe this is a test run for applying it to American service member and American leaders in the future.
Well said. I couldn't agree with you more. And certainly the court has badly damaged its reputation, and it's going to have a long ways to go to recover from that. So with that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, as I said in my opening statement, I hope that this committee can better collaborate to swiftly confirm career Foreign Service officers. These are patriotic Americans who have served under both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they work to advance U.S. national security interests. Delays and vacant posts hurt America's interest. I know you agree with that because we've had that conversation. But will you commit to working with Chairman Risch and me to prioritize the advancement and confirmation of career State Department officials?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but I would also point to this fact that I think we're going to begin by prioritizing. We're going to look at what are the key issues in the world. There are obviously every post in the world is important, or it shouldn't exist. And then the question is, which are the ones we bring to you first? And those are the ones that I think are most critical. So obviously, I think you'll see our nominees for the deputy posts, which are critically important, all the undersecretaries as well. And what I've endeavored to do is we interview and identify people, and I believe I've met with and interviewed most of the candidates for those top posts, is I want to bring you people that are three things. Number one, are aligned to the mission. I think that's critically important, whether they be Foreign Service officers. I'm not talking about political alignment. I'm talking about alignment with the mission that we've outlined for American foreign policy, which is one of the things that I think has hurt the State Department under numerous administrations, is sometimes the mission, or what is the core mission of the department, has not been well defined. That's on us, and it's our obligation to define that. So number one, aligned to the mission. Number two, the capability to do the job. And I can tell you now that in my entire service on this committee, which spans 14 years, we always had fellows from the Department of State, I believe all of whom are still in the service of our country. And I intend, because I know them and I've worked with them, to utilize their skill sets in the department. And in fact, a couple who we hope will be returning home soon from foreign postings to work with us at the State Department, closer to my office. But the point is that we want to have people that are highly capable, both those who we bring from what they call political appointees, but also those that are promoted from within the Foreign Service. And then the third are people that we can get through the committee, because time is of the essence. Now, you may not agree with all their views, whether they be Foreign Service officers or whether they be political, but I think it's important and we're not going to exclude someone just because we think that maybe they're going to have a rougher confirmation process than someone else. But I do think it's important that we have people in these positions as quickly as possible. And having served for 14 years on that side of this room, I understand that one of the things we can do to help expedite that is to bring in people that will do a good job, who are qualified for the job or mission aligned, but also that can move through this process quickly enough so that they can be at post and begin to fulfill their duties. If I have to wait a year to get them in place, well, I'm not sure on some of these issues we face today, we have a year to wait.
I certainly agree with that, and I appreciate your focus on mission and qualifications, because I think the committee will be looking closely at that. I want to go now to NATO, because in 2023, Congress overwhelmingly passed the bipartisan Kaine-Rubio provision prohibiting any president from withdrawing the United States from NATO without Senate approval or an act of Congress. Will you commit to adhering to Senate approval or an act of Congress as required under that law that you authored if President Trump attempts to withdraw the U.S. from NATO?
Well, first, let me say that President Trump has appointed an ambassador nominee for NATO, which clearly indicates his role to engage in that. Second is the law is what it is. Obviously, as you've mentioned, I was a co-sponsor of the law, and so it's tough to say I'm not in support of a law that I hope to pass, and that I think it's an important role for Congress to play, because frankly, it's not just about the withdrawal piece of it, it's the contributions we make towards the power of the purse still resides with the Congress. Now, maybe as if confirmed, moving towards the executive branch, I'll become I'll forget that lesson a little bit. I hope not. But ultimately, I still recognize and understand that the power of the purse is with Congress, and it's an incredibly important power. Let me point on NATO one thing. I think there's a misunderstanding about it. The NATO alliance is a very important alliance. I believe that. I believe alliances can be, and has been very useful. Without the NATO alliance, there is no end to the Cold War. In fact, without the NATO alliance, it's quite possible that much of what today, at the time, today we know as the Europe, would have fallen victim to aggression. But what's important for the United States is not just to have defense allies, it's to have capable defense allies, allies who are capable of defending their region. And I think there is a question to be asked. I'm not stating a public policy position, I'm stating a question to be asked, and that is, should the role of the United States in NATO in the 21st century be the primary defense role or as a backstop to aggression, with countries in the region assuming more of that responsibility by contributing more? Now, look, in fairness, and I think the further east you move in Europe, the more money you see spent on the military as a percentage of GDP. But I think there's been broad acknowledgement across Europe and across multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that our NATO partners, these are rich, advanced economies, need to contribute more to their own defense and ultimately to the NATO partnership as well. And that's a demand that's been made by multiple presidents across the years. And the fact that that is true has been revealed by what's happened with Ukraine. Look at the ramp up in defense spending and the industrial capacity of multiple countries in Europe as a result of an armed conflict. Imagine if that capacity had been there before, it quite possibly might have had a deterrent effect as well. So I think it's important that we have alliances, but we have to have alliances with strong and capable partners, and not those who sort of have viewed the US and the NATO defense agreement as an excuse to spend less on defense and more on some domestic needs. We have domestic needs too. These advanced, rich countries in Western Europe have enormous safety nets programs that they fund. We have domestic needs as well, but they've been able to divert or grow those programs because they don't have to spend as much on defense as we do as a percentage of our overall economy. And that dynamic needs to change. And I expect that President Trump will continue to forcefully make that point.
And as you know, this committee and the Senate NATO Observer Group, which I co-chair, has made that point repeatedly, and we are now up to 23 of the 32 NATO nations who are meeting their 2% of GDP, and we have a number of them who are going beyond that, and it's appropriate. And I think the sentiment on this committee would be to agree with what you're saying, but to ensure that we continue to have a strong NATO, I think will be important not only to European security, but most important to our own security. I appreciate, we talked about Ukraine. I appreciate your past leadership in supporting Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. More recently, you voted against supplemental funding for Ukraine and against forgiving loans for Ukraine in November, loans that would be critical to Ukraine's economic stability. So can you talk about how your views on Ukraine have developed and where you are now, and what you think is important for us to do in order to ensure that there's the strongest possible negotiating position if Ukraine and Russia do get to the negotiating table?
Sure. First, let me point out, and although I'll still speak to my view of the process, that I voted against that bill because I said I would not vote for a bill unless it addressed the crisis at our southern border as part of the overall arrangement. That was not done, and so I voted against it. That said, here's my view of a situation. Once this war became what we now know it is, and that is a war of attrition, a stalemate, a protracted conflict, the dynamic on that situation has changed. It has. And I believe, and I think that this echoes with the president. Let me first echo the president's words and what he said in an interview about a year ago He was asked about the war in Ukraine. He says, I want the dying to stop. I want people to stop dying. I want the killing to stop. And frankly, I don't know how anyone could say they don't. The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. Millions of Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. And the disruption, that means how many of them are going to come back, and what are they going to come back to? Even as I speak to you now, the Ukrainian infrastructure and their energy infrastructure is being decimated in ways that are going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild over the next decades. So this is an important conflict, and I think it should be the official position of the United States that this war should be brought to an end. And the question becomes, what role can we play? And I think the first is by making that abundantly clear. And my differences with the Biden administration throughout this process is that they never clearly delineated what the end goal of the conflict was. What exactly were we funding? What exactly were we putting money towards? And many occasions it sounded like however much it takes for however long it takes. That is not a realistic or prudent position. The truth of the matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen. It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion, just given the size dynamic. I saw a quote recently, and I wish I could attribute to who it was, but the quote was, and I think it was very wise, where they said the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor. But it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States lend itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage. Putin's goal now is to have maximum leverage so that he can basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years. And that's not an outcome I think any of us would favor. By the same token, I think it's important that the Ukrainians have leverage, but they also will have to make concessions to reach this agreement. It's going to be very difficult. This will not be easy. Conflicts of this nature that have historical underpinnings to it are going to require a lot of hard diplomacy and tough work. But that's something that needs to happen. This conflict needs to end.
Well, I'm out of time, but I appreciate your last comment about the importance of leverage. And it's important for the United States to do what we can to help provide that leverage to Ukraine so that they can be in the best negotiating position possible with Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination to this very, very difficult job. I want to thank you for your previous service in the U.S. Senate and your willingness to take on this job should you be confirmed. And I also want to thank your family as well for their support for you to be able to be a U.S. Senator and to apply for this job as Secretary of State. And I want also to express my gratitude to all the members of the State Department. We have a lot of people who choose to serve our country overseas, spend time away from their friends and family, and I can't think of a more noble calling. You're taking over a department that's very, very important to us. On Sunday, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, said, quote, "The American people are safer and the country is better off than we were 4 years ago." Let me repeat, the American people are safer and the country is better off than 4 years ago. I don't know who believes that. I don't believe that. I think the election results demonstrate the vast majority of Americans don't believe that. We don't believe it at home. Inflation has hurt average Americans' pocketbooks. Open border policies have put Americans at risk. And I don't believe we see it overseas. In fact, Senator Rubio, should you be confirmed, you're being handed a job at a time when this country is in the most danger we've been in since World War II. It's a very dangerous time in the world, and your opening remarks demonstrate that you know that. We're not better off, and we're not safer. President Biden started this with a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that projected weakness and an incomprehension of what it means to have a policy of deterrence. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine and started the largest war in Europe since World War II after that withdrawal. I believe it's because he saw weakness in this Biden administration. It's been the president's fear of helping Ukraine that has contributed to putting them in the untenable position they are today by slow rolling the weapons that Ukraine needs to be able to defend themselves. His incomprehensible and incoherent policy has caused him to handcuff American liquid natural gas exports while delaying tough sanctions on the Russian oil and gas industry, which, as you know, is the lifeblood of the Russian war machine. The Middle East is equally disastrous. Instead of enforcing sanctions on Iran, Biden naively tried to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal, enabling the regime to generate $100 billion in oil revenue. And I want to point out that during the Trump administration, because of sanctions, Iran's foreign reserves fell from $122 billion to less than $14 billion. That hampered their ability to be able to fund terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. What the Biden administration has done is allowed the Iranian regime to enrich enough weapons-grade uranium to be a week or two away from having a nuclear weapon. And since October 7th, President Biden has not supported Israel in the way he's needed. And because of the previous mentioned money that he's allowed the Iranians to have that has funded the terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, our allies like Israel have been attacked, and we've been attacked directly. Thankfully, Israel's had the courage to stand up to these terrorists and take matters into its own hand. And it's led to the decimation of Hamas and Hezbollah. But no amount of revisionist history can change the fact that this was despite the lack of support from the Biden administration, not because of the support from the Biden administration. And of course, let's not forget North Korea and how dangerous they have become, and the fact that we are now seeing North Korean troops in Europe. A thought 4 years ago that was unthought by anybody. And of course, one of the most concerning things is Biden's weakness has emboldened the greatest adversary we have on the face of the earth right now, which is the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China is the head of the snake of this axis of dictators that are challenging the United States today. They're challenging our freedom, our security, and the very way of life we have. Beijing has had a direct hand in each of the problems I just mentioned. That's why addressing any one of them cannot be done without making sure that we are thinking about how we are deterring the People's Republic of China. When everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. And Senator Rubio, your top priority must be the People's Republic of China. Since the election in November, so this is all within the last 2 months, the PRC has hacked our Treasury Department, including CFIUS. Continue what has been described as the worst telecom hack in U.S. history. Sabotaged important undersea communication cables in Asia and Europe, deployed ships to the South China Sea to harass our allies like the Philippines in their own territorial waters, simulated a naval blockade of the Japanese islands for the first time, conducted the largest naval drills in decades targeting Taiwan and the broader Western Pacific, revealed new mobile piers suitable for a Taiwan invasion, unveiled advanced aircraft, and launched the world's largest amphibious warship. And they've allowed Iran to draw down and ship nearly 3 million barrels of oil from a storage site in China. It's obvious that Xi Jinping is positioning his chess pieces in preparation for war. He's directed his military to be prepared to take Taiwan by 2027, and folks, that's only 2 years away. Now, it's true that does not mean that he will invade in 2027, and it's also true that it's not predetermined, but it should be very concerning to all of us that he's given his military that direction. Because time and time again, dictators tell people what they're going to do, and then they go out and try and do it. The only thing that dictators respond to is force, strength, peace through strength. This was something Ronald Reagan understood a long time ago. And it's what we have to get back to in the United States. Xi Jinping is vowed to be the world dominating power by 2049. We should take him at his word. That's what he believes he is going to try and do. It's time for us to go on the offensive and abandon illusions about what kind of adversary we're faced. This is not a managed competition. This is a competition we must win. It will take more than an all of government approach. It'll take an all of society approach to be able to win this. As our lead diplomat, Senator Rubio, you are in a position to set the tone. And that's why I can't think of a better pick to be the Secretary of State than you. So, first of all, do you agree that the PRC is the biggest threat that we face as the United States?
The Communist Party of China is, that leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin. There's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places. But the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went. And I think you're alluding to it in your statement. I know you may have another question. I don't want to eat up all your time, but I do want to say this. The Chinese believe that the United States are a great power in inevitable decline and that they are an inevitable rise. Now, they already are. They're going to be a rich and powerful country, and we're going to have to deal with them. The danger is that because of our own actions, in many cases, a dangerous imbalance is built up in that relationship. We allowed them for years to pretend that they were some developing countries, so we should allow them to continue to cheat on trade and commerce. We should allow them to continue to expand. They lied about not militarizing and populating island chains in the South China Sea and the like. We allowed them for years before we got serious about it to conduct grotesque human rights violations against Uighur Muslims, as an example. One of the most horrifying things happening on the planet. And for years, no one talked about it, which, by the way, not just has a human rights component to it, it allows them to use slave labor to produce goods that, at the expense of the rest of the world. Talk about not just a horrific humanitarian crisis, but an unfair trade practice as well. We've allowed them to get away with things. And frankly, the Chinese did what any country in the world would do given these opportunities. They took advantage of it. And so I think now we're dealing with the ramifications of it. I agree 100% what you said, but I remind you, and I remind everyone, I guess I want to make this point, that much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
And with 4 seconds left, how are you going to explain that to your average American that we need this all-size society approach? And your point exactly that it needs to begin here at home, and so that people from my state, Nebraska, will understand and get on board.
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
Thank you, Senator Rubio.
Next is Senator Marco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Rubio. And I've enjoyed working with you on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which engages in many issues related to their treatment of folks from the Tibetans to the Uyghurs, to their position regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan. But let's talk about Taiwan. I had the chance to go to Taiwan in the year 2000. It was the second presidential election there, and it was the first one where people were becoming convinced that they actually might be able to hold a a democracy. I believe they've earned the right to have a voice in international affairs. And I also believe that they are a great risk right now with mainland China. Xi's plan to be aggressive militarily towards them, as my colleague Senator Ricketts just noted. Will you support in your role as Secretary of State Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And will you support the porcupine strategy providing that we will supply them with defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability? By the way, that phrase is from the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. It's in our current law.
Yeah, let me just point out that on the Taiwan Relation Act, and I believe it was the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple or consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear are our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year, they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan was anywhere near it. So this is just one more example of how they're being excluded. I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on Earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7-8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, then they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped and others who have stayed strong in that regard. On the porcupine strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people or if anyone's watching this, I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the porcupine strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit. We want to discourage that by the Chinese believing that, yes, could they ultimately win an invasion of Taiwan, but the price would be too high to pay. It's basically deterrence. And I think that's critical, not just to defending Taiwan, to preventing a cataclysmic military intervention in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what it would be. And I would make one more point, and again, I don't mean to want to be alarmist about it, but if you listen to Xi Jinping, and it's important when you listen to him, and I say listen, read, don't read the English translation that they put out, because the English translation is never right. You have to read the real translation on what they actually said in their native tongue. What they're basically saying is that this is a foundational and definitional issue for Xi Jinping personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade.
And so strongly support for the porcupine strategy. Thank you. And I know people in Taiwan.
I just don't like saying porcupine, but yes.
You know, when I went to Taiwan in November and met with the president and other leaders, they are extremely nervous right now. And part of the reason they're nervous is they're concerned about how things play out in Ukraine as possibly creating an incentive for China. And I take your point about the current stalemate and the fact that there is a range of objectives that are out of reach for other side. But I do feel like our partnership with NATO and our continued supply of war material that enable Ukrainians to keep fighting until that resolution is done is extremely important, because if Ukraine collapses, it will say a lot to China about whether we will stay the course in assisting Taiwan. Not to mention, it will be a catastrophe for democracy and a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. I don't know if you share that view.
Well, I think, first of all, our goal, as President Trump has stated, is he wants the dying to stop. He wants the killing to stop. So it's very difficult to reach an accord or an agreement that begins with a ceasefire and ends with a peace agreement unless both sides have some leverage. Now, there's some leverage that exists beyond military capabilities as well. We have a significant number of sanctions on the Russian Federation, and they continue to grow and expand, and other nations do as well. And that will have to be part of this conversation in terms of bringing about a peaceful resolution. And then there's the question of the long-term security and stability of Ukraine. Beyond even if the conflict were to end, there needs to be the capability of Ukraine to defend itself. And it's a point that I made back as far as 2014, when the United States under the Obama administration chose not to provide weapon capabilities. And I think we lost a turn during that period.
I'm going to keep rolling here for a few other questions. One of the things China is doing is deeply engaged in transnational repression, which means threatening people here in the United States that they will disappear or kill or harm their family members back in China if they exercise their free rights here in our country. And also they're seeking to repatriate Uyghurs who have escaped China. And right now there are 48 Uyghurs that are in Thailand, and Thailand is on the verge of repatriating them back to China. Will you lobby for Thailand to not send these Uyghurs back to the horror they will face if they're returned?
Yes, and the good news is that Thailand is actually a very strong U.S. partner, strong historical ally as well. And so that is an area where I think diplomacy could really achieve results because of how important that relationship and how close it is. I think it's also one more opportunity for us to remind the world of what exactly we're talking about here. This is not some obscure issue. These are people who are basically being rounded up because of their ethnicity and religion, and they are being put into camps. They're being put into what they call re-education centers. They're being stripped of their identity. Their children's names are being changed. It's one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened. And they're being put into forced labor, literally slave labor.
And I will say our work together on the Forced Labor Prevention Act, Uyghur Forced Labor, was tremendous. Thank you for championing that. I'm encouraging other nations, including Canada, Mexico, and Europe, to follow the rebuttable presumption strategy we put into that bill, because right now, if our slave labor products or China's slave labor products are rejected here, they're shipped to Canada, and we need to expand on that. I want to turn to another point. Our companies face in China often the requirement for partnerships or location or what products they can produce or the theft of their intellectual property. Meanwhile, we're helping their economy by being a major supplier of fossil gas, LNG, to China. Should we be strengthening the Chinese economy by sending them LNG?
Well, I think that is a good point to raise in that regard, because I will tell you that is one of the things that's going to have to be discussed in the broader relationship with China. And that is, it is one of the things we actually export to China. They import a lot this way. One of the few things that we export is in great capacity is these long-term contracts that are tied up either directly to China or through third countries. Because some of this obviously is exported to a third country who in turn sends it to China either as a direct sale or as a byproduct. So I think that has to be on the table as a number of other measures that we have in leverage as we engage the Chinese in this geopolitical perspective. I would go further and point out that the Chinese also have, I believe, the world's largest surplus refining capacity. They've invested very heavily in that as well. And that's one more area where I think our energy policy will be critical and bringing some geopolitical stability to our relationship with them. I know you sponsored a bill to cut off the exports.
I've focused on China, but I want to turn to humanitarian issues. I, by the way, fully support Israel's ability to respond to Hamas, but I am very concerned about how it has played out in terms of the massive humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Will you help lead the world in responding to those humanitarian conditions? And there is a proposal for a broad regional agreement that would provide security to Israel, peace with all their Arab neighbors, building on the Abraham Accords, that in return would create a framework to have concrete steps towards a Palestinian state. I believe that's our best bet to break the cycle of hate and war that we've been trapped in my entire lifetime. How will you pursue breaking this cycle of hate and war, and will you support humanitarian support to Gaza?
Yeah. So my first point is I am hopeful, and again, been here, so I don't know if any news has emerged in our time during this hearing, but I am hopeful that, that there is an agreement in place that will bring hostages back immediately in an exchange and in a three-phase plan that Secretary Blinken sort of has outlined over the last 24 hours, and that credit to both the Biden administration and the Trump transition work side by side on helping this become about. And I hope that comes about. And part of that phrase, part of that deal, as I understand it, is it has this very tenuous but important 6-week transitional period where it's going to require international cooperation to bring some level of stability in administration. And that could serve as, assuming it works, that could serve as a foundation to build upon. I would also point to one more thing, and that is, we don't know yet for sure, but there are opportunities available now in the Middle East that did not exist 90 days ago. Whether it's what's happened in Lebanon, whether it's what's happened in Syria, whether it's what hopefully will happen with the ceasefire and the release of hostages after horrifying detention and unjustifiable actions by Hamas. Whether it's any of these three things are all in combination. There are now factors at play in the Middle East that I think we can build upon and may open the door to extraordinary and historic opportunities, not just to provide for Israel's security, but ultimately begin to confront some of these other factors. But these things, again, are going to be hard work, and they'll require us to take advantage of those opportunities if they exist.
Thank you.
Senator McCormick.
Great. Senator Rubio, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to working with you closely on many of the issues we're going to discuss today. As a senator, you've been a strong voice for American leadership, and I'm really confident you'll be a strong Secretary of State on behalf of President Trump and the American people for advancing America's interest. I believe you're the right man for the job. When we met privately, we talked about a range of topics, from China to Israel to the fate of the hostages in Gaza to energy policy. We also talked about something that hits home here in Pennsylvania for my constituents, which is the fate of Mark Fogel. As you and I discussed, Mark has been imprisoned by the Russians since 2021. I've had a chance to meet with his mom, 95-year-old Mafa. She was at the Butler rally with myself and President Trump in the front row when he was shot. We need to bring him home. It took far too long for the State Department to designate Mark as wrongfully detained by the Russian government, and was really a gut punch to many of us in Pennsylvania that Mark wasn't included in the swap last year. So, Senator, will you commit to working with me and others in our delegation to make Mark's return home a high priority?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been involved already. I've met with those families as well. We've had conversations about this. And there are two things I'd point to. Number one, this is a ridiculous case. I mean, this is an American that clearly there was an order given at some level that if you see an American and you have anything you can charge them with, let's charge them and let's collect these because we can trade them in the future for something. There's a global market for this now. And it's one of the challenges of the 21st century. There is now an active global market for detaining Americans wrongfully in Venezuela, in Russia, in China, or somewhere else, Iran, and then using them to trade for something they want in the future. And so I think there needs to be greater awareness put out about that reality. Although people are still going to travel and Americans are still a free people that have the ability to travel, this is a real risk. In this particular case, this has nothing to do with politics. No one can claim, nor do they, that he's a spy or that he's involved in a national security threat. And so this is a case that has to be elevated, and hopefully one that can be done through strong private diplomacy at a minimum as a goodwill gesture. Because if they're not willing to do this, then not to mention the broader challenges posed to us by what Putin is doing in Ukraine, then I think the chances of improvement in U.S.-Russian relations are impossible. But this is not that this would solve that problem, but it is at a minimum the kind of thing you would hope to see if anyone is serious about improving relations, especially if we can get the situation in Ukraine to a peaceful standing. And I hope that this case will be one that we can reach a good result on.
Good. Thank you. On the sad topic of hostages, as you know, Dean and I, my wife, live in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. We've been part of a meeting with hostages in Israel and in the United States as recently as last week. Noah Aragami and Ronan and Orna Nutra, who lost their son, sadly, Omer, recently came to visit. And, President Trump said recently that all hell will be to pay if the hostages aren't released. If confirmed, what emphasis would you put on releasing those hostages in Gaza? Do you agree that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza absolutely must include the release of those hostages?
Well, it must include it because if it doesn't, there won't be a ceasefire for long. I mean, the Israeli commitment to bringing back their civilians, that's what these are. These are civilians. These are people, these are innocent people who were targeted and have been held in horrifying conditions, the health and well-being of which many of them we still don't know, but we believe there's a substantial number that are going to be released as part of this first tranche. And that's an important point as well. You know, in regard to this agreement that has now been publicly reported on, it's not everyone. I think there's a first tranche of women, children, and people over a certain age, and then a second tranche of releases of males that are of military age, who they claim are all combatants, even though they are not. They just happen to be of a certain age. But without the hostage situation resolved, this situation will not be resolved. It is the linchpin of what's happened now. Hamas has been severely degraded, but these people, that include a number of American citizens, need to be home as soon as possible, and that will remain a priority in any engagement that we're involved in with regards to not just a ceasefire, but some permanent peace process moving forward.
Very good. Thank you. Since October 7th, there's been a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism, pro-terrorist violence in our cities, on college campuses. You and I had the opportunity to write an op-ed together. And in that op-ed, we called on foreign nationals who support Hamas or other terrorist organizations to lose their visas and to be sent back to their home countries. As Secretary of State, of course, you'll be responsible for overseeing the issuance of visas. How will you enforce our laws to ensure that we remove supporters of terrorist groups from our country?
Listen, my view on this is one of common sense. Okay? If you apply for a visa to come into the United States, and in the process of being looked at, it comes to light that you're a supporter of Hamas, we wouldn't let you in. If we knew you were a supporter of Hamas, we would not give you a visa. So now that you got the visa and you're inside the U.S., and now we realize you're a supporter of Hamas, we should remove your visa. If you could not come in because you're a supporter of Hamas, you should not be able to stay on a visa if you're a supporter of Hamas. That's how I view it. And I think that's just an issue of common sense. And we intend to be very forceful about that.
Good. Thank you. Fentanyl is killing 4,000 Pennsylvanians each year, over 200 Americans a day. President Trump campaigned on this throughout the country, in Pennsylvania, as did I, on we have to stop that flow of fentanyl. And of course, violent criminal groups in Mexico, including the Jalisco and Sinaloa cartels, terrorize our communities here at home with this deadly fentanyl, and the Mexican people with endless violence. As Secretary, will you initiate the process to designate these groups, these cartels, as foreign terrorist organizations? And if so, can you describe for the American people the national security tools that unlocks, that designation unlocks, to degrade the cartels?
Well, first of all, the designation of a designated foreign terrorist organization brings with it a host of things. It makes it illegal to cooperate or work with them in any way, or to be supportive of their endeavors. It cuts off access to all sorts of banking opportunities and the like around the world where it's important to move money around. Now, that said, it's probably an imperfect tool when it comes to these groups that you're discussing, because these are sophisticated criminal enterprises. They are terrorizing the United States, but they are sophisticated criminal enterprises, and they operate in the trafficking of people, drugs, and migrants to horrifying effect. Sadly, they also have basically operational control over huge swaths of the border regions between Mexico and the United States. That's just an unfortunate fact, and it's one we're going to have to confront with our partners in Mexico, is that these sophisticated transnational terroristic organizations have operational and functional control over huge swaths of areas that border the United States of America. And so whether that is the tool that we use, which is maybe the appropriate one, or some new one that we come up with, it is important for us not just to go after these groups, but to identify them and call them for what they are. And that is terroristic in their nature, because they are terrorizing America with mass migration and with the flow of drugs.
What about military force?
Well, that's an option the president has at his disposal. Obviously, it's not one that is in the purview of the Department of State. I think President Trump is someone that never publicly discusses his options and leaves himself the flexibility to act. I think there's a lot we can and will continue to do in close partnership with our allies in Mexico. I think there's more they can do as well to confront this challenge. And my preference would be, from the Department of State's perspective, my preference would be that we can work with the Mexicans on this issue cooperatively, because it is impacting their nation as much as ours. These sophisticated groups, these criminal organizations, don't simply threaten America, they threaten the Mexican political process. In the last election, you had multiple presidential candidates and other candidates to other offices assassinated. You've had journalists targeted and assassinated for speaking out against these groups. So these groups don't simply terrorize the United States, they're terrorizing and in some ways undermining the Mexican government and Mexican sovereignty and the health and well-being of the Mexican people. And so my hope in a perfect world is that we could work in close collaboration with Mexican authorities to take these groups out.
Very good. Thank you. Final question. The Chinese Communist Party, as you said in your testimony, has waged a deliberate campaign of economic warfare against the United States and our allies. We need to restore, as President Trump has said, reciprocity in that economic relationship and impose cost on Beijing for hurting American workers. How can the United States counter that campaign? How do you think about the economic tools that the administration can apply to cut off the flow of American capital and technology that supports China's geopolitical ambitions?
Well, and again, much of what it comes to trade and so forth in this administration will be handled through the Department of Commerce, but we'll certainly have an economic undersecretary and a whole entire bureaus that will be dedicated to what we can contribute to that endeavor. So I'll just share my views broadly on it. Number one, I think it would make common sense to everybody that if, by and large, a relationship in which their companies can do whatever they want here, but we can't do it there, is a pretty unfair relationship. And it's something we've allowed in the past for allied countries who are small, poor, and developing. That cannot continue, in my view, and I think that's the president's view. The second is there's much that needs to be done with regards here domestically. I think we once again as a nation, this is not a Department of State issue, but once again as a nation need to prioritize the importance of our industrial capacity and our access to supply chains domestically, especially in key and critical industries. Maybe not every industry, but some key industries. We should either have a domestic capacity or an allied capacity that's reliable and can't be used against us in a moment of conflict as leverage. The third point I would make is we need to be actively engaged in the world. As an example, the Chinese own significant mineral rights and mining rights in Argentina, in Chile, throughout Africa. It's one of the reasons why the polar region and the Arctic region has become so critical as well in that regard, is because they are scooping up all over the world these mineral rights, port rights, et cetera, that place us at an enormous disadvantage in the long term. And it's what I said in that short answer is if this trend continues, we are going to wind up living in a world where much of what we depend on for our security, our health, our safety, and our economic prosperity will largely depend on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. And that cannot be a world that we leave for our children.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Coons.
Thank you. Senator Rubio, I look forward to this hearing and to our service together. Welcome to the other side of the dais, and welcome to your wife, Jeanette, your children, your family. Thank you for your service. I have three questions broadly of nominees. Do they have the qualifications to appropriately serve? Do they have a policy alignment with our core national interests? And do they have the integrity and character to serve? We may have policy disagreements, but we've had multiple areas of convergence. Over the time we've served here in the Senate together, I had my folks go back and look. We've co-sponsored nearly 60 bills together. So I hope we can continue to find constructive ways to partner. I have a number of questions to get through, so I'll try to move briskly. With regards to special envoys, President-elect Trump has appointed a series of special envoys focused on a wide range of areas. And some of these, I think, can genuinely complement, not undermine or distract from State Department's core efforts. The special envoy for hostage affairs, for example, Adam Bowler, I look forward to working with, as Senator McCormick asked about. There's a number of key issues around hostage taking of Americans. There's a bipartisan bill Senator Risch and I have on this that we hope to work with you on. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, I think will be central to achieving an outcome in Ukraine that is a lasting and secure peace and prevents further Russian aggression. But others like Rick Grinnell for special missions and Massad Boulos for the Arab world concern me in terms of the potential for mission conflict or conflict of interest. How will you work to ensure that state maintains its authority and encourage the administration to conduct a full vetting of any potential conflicts of interest and to ensure there's clarity of alignment with special envoys?
Sure. Thank you for the question, because I think it's a valid one. With the exception of Mr. Boulos, who I don't know, may have met once but don't know, every one of the envoys that have been named so far is someone that I've worked with in the past and expect to work well with in the future. To me, the expression of a special envoy is critically important. Where it's most successful, it's on a complex issue with a defined goal and it's an expression of presidential priorities. So Sudan is an example of a special envoy, and Mr. Perriello and the job he's done there. And this is in addition to the fact that we have an ambassador and we have other diplomatic presence there that can be very complementary. So the way this will work and how I anticipate it will work is these envoys work for the president in coordination with us. These are all people, with the exception of one who I'm not disparaging. I just don't know him, but I've worked with everyone else that you've mentioned, are people that are going to be focused on this full like a laser. And they will need to do so not simply in coordination with the Department of State because of subject matter expertise. Let's say you reach an agreement or you reach an outcome, you're still going to need the technical support necessary to pull this off. And we have a wide array of experts in the Department of State that will help achieve that. And it'll involve other elements of the U.S. government. So as an example, if you're going to reach an agreement on migration, say in the Western Hemisphere, that also could entail the necessity to have a conversation about trade policy and tariffs that will involve commerce and others. That's the only way this will work, and that's how I anticipate it working.
I've agreed to co-chair with Senator Haggerty a Commission on Reform and Modernization of the State Department that Senator Cardin created with him. We cannot, in my view, do more with less given the challenges of the global moment. I think we need more investment in U.S. diplomacy and development as instruments of national power, but we also need to address efficiencies and make sure that we are streamlining and focusing the department and supporting its workforce, the Foreign Service. How will you work to make sure that the Trump administration's efficiency mandate will strengthen and not deplete core state functions?
Well, first of all, I think the work of this new committee that's being set up as a result of the legislation that passed will be critical. My understanding is the impediment was that not all the appointments have been made. Maybe
Right.
That's now changed. And we eagerly await that because I do think that there are two things that are very important. The first is when we talk about efficiency, the efficiency isn't simply just saving money. The efficiency is improving performance. A key part of the State Department is customer service. We provide consular affairs, passports, visas, all kinds of work around the world for Americans who are stranded or in trouble or need to get somewhere. Improving that experience for the consumer is one of the top priorities we need to have. How can we leverage, and I think Secretary Blinken has begun this work, we need to build on this. How can we infuse technology, AI and the like, not simply to improve the customer service aspects of the State Department, but improve the productivity? If somehow through the leveraging technology appropriately, we can get people at the State Department to achieve 3 times the amount of work than they do now because it takes less time to do these tasks or frees them up to do other tasks, that would be an enormous win. And I hope the commission will look at those aspects of this as well.
I understand, Senator, if I might move to another question, that multilateral organizations concern and frustrate many of us. Some of their actions have been counter to American interest. But when we've withdrawn from multilateral organizations, and in particular some UN entities, it's also given an opening to our adversaries. The previous Trump administration withdrew from UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization. And I'm concerned that if we do so without thinking through the consequences, we may abandon our chance to implement our agenda around human rights, around 5G standards, around technical standards that matter for the 21st century. Do you support sustained U.S. participation in multilateral organizations? And how will you work to strengthen our leadership in those institutions in ways that prevent our adversaries from advancing their competing agendas?
Well, I want to point back to what I said at the opening, and that is our engagement in any international agreement or any international arrangement or any international organization has to be driven by the answer to one of 3 questions. Will our involvement in this organization make us safer, make us more prosperous, make us more secure? It has to be justified by an American interest. It just does. I mean, we're in an era where we need to really, it should have always been that way, but now more than ever. And so each of these will have different components to it. I think there's a second component of funding, and that is, should the United States be funding organizations who in many cases are pursuing and or achieving outcomes that are contrary to the national interest of the United States? Each of these will require a serious examination as we work through them and a justification to Congress about why we're no longer funding it or we're no longer participating. I think you do point to one that I can tell you right now is one that will be critical for us to be engaged in, and that is the setting of standards. But the setting of standards for people to understand is it's not simply from these organizations, it also becomes practical. So throughout Africa, we are now seeing the deployment of these safe city programs by Huawei. Now, this isn't just a commercial deal for Huawei. This is the ability to ingrain itself in the telecommunication of these countries and establish itself as the leader in 5G. And now all of the other technologies that depend on 5G, additive manufacturing, the 3D printing and so forth, autonomous vehicles, they will all have to be drawn to the standard set by Huawei. That's not because an international organization set it up. It's because they've established market dominance, and it's a concern we have in multiple parts of the global south and the developing world. We need to be engaged that way as well.
I very much look forward to working with you on deploying the full tool set that allows us to compete in the global south, including the Development Finance Corporation, something Senator Corker and I led on this committee, in which I know you see the potential for. As I come to the end of my time, I've worked hard with Senator Graham to get signed into law 2 different bills I wanted to mention. The Global Fragility Act, which presses the Department of Defense, Department of State, AID to have a common strategy in fragile states and to effectively. Recently, for Act, something that Meeks and I worked on, create security and governed and insecure in the global south, in South America, in Africa, and Southeast Asia. Both of these bills address the root causes of instability and facilitate cost-effective uses of American dollars by encouraging engagement with the private sector and philanthropy. Can I count on your support to work, as the Secretary have confirmed in the State Department, to implement these 2 laws more effectively in the coming years?
Well, and the conservation one, I believe, just passed, right? Most recently.
Just signed into law. Yeah.
We're getting there just in time to help you with it, and it's had strong bipartisan support. On the global fragility, this has been ongoing for quite a bit of time, and we'll have to go back and check on the progress. I don't know entirely. I know there's a 10-year plan, and there's the 5 countries that we've identified. And by the way, no country likes to be identified as fragile, so we have to be sensitive about how we do it. But I think that's a component. We got to go back and see where we are on that 10-year planning, because that's an important way of leveraging both economic security and development efforts in the whole of government. And I think key to this is going to be not simply the Department of State, but it's that steering committee that's supposed to meet every 3 months at the National Security Council. That core work is happening. Look, are great, but if someone's not measuring at the end, whether it's reaching its income, we're going to have a huge problem. But the goal of that legislation, as I recall, is and believe still, is we want to get ahead of this before a crisis. This is about preventing crisis, which is, frankly, is a lot cheaper and a lot better than actually dealing with crisis after the fact. And so identifying places around the world that are in danger of becoming chaotic, uncertain, insecure, and getting ahead of it, and a variety of means to prevent that from happening. And preventing those crises from happening is going to save us a lot of headaches, a lot of danger, and a lot of money.
In closing, I'll just repeat something I've heard from several of my colleagues. I think that our global network of alliances and partners rooted in our shared values, a commitment to democracy and human rights, is essential to our national security. And how the war in Ukraine ends and whether a peace agreement there lasts and secures Ukraine from ongoing Russian aggression is critical to our credibility and security and to sustaining that network of allies and partners. I hope that's something you strongly agree with. I look forward to working with you towards that end.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Next up is going to be Senator Daines, and after that will be Senator Murphy. About that time, it's going to be noon. We're going to take a short 5-minute break at noon. Not a Senate 5 minutes, but a for real 5-minute break at noon. And those of you who have a seat here, I'd suggest you don't leave, because it's going to be difficult to claim your seat back if you're here as an observer. So with that, Senator Daines, welcome to the committee. Glad
Chairman,
to have you.
thank you. Marco, it's good to have you here. I've got a great view here from the dais, seeing your family behind you, seeing Jeanette, Daniela, the rest of the Rubio family. What a moment of great honor, celebration for the Rubios, culminating on Monday, when your family will celebrate the 1-month anniversary of Anthony Rubio's touchdown as a Florida Gator. So congratulations on every front, proud dad. Look, you are charged with one of the most important tasks I think the administration will have, and that is advancing President Trump's agenda and representing the interests of the United States around the world. I can't think of a better nominee for Secretary of State to serve under President Trump than Marco Rubio. You will have a lot of active conflicts we're working together on as we think of what's going on in Ukraine, Israel, Sudan, ongoing nuclear weapons program in Iran, the tyranny in Venezuela, the New START treaty has been completely disregarded by Russia, and not to mention what we have to think about strategies relates to China. I could continue to list the results that we saw from the Trump administration with the Abraham Accords and really moving forward here with significant substantive advancements of American interests abroad. But look, this next administration and the leadership of President Trump and your service will be extremely consequential. This posting could not be more important. Marco, as you know, Iran's the world's leading sponsor of terror. In 2024, Iran exported roughly 587 million barrels of oil, an increase of over 10% over the prior year. These illegal oil sales fund Hamas, the Hezbollah terrorism, the Houthis, the nuclear arms programs, drone technology that's being used right now by the Russians against Ukraine. These oil sales are directly resulting in global unrest, and they're costing innocent lives. Senator, if confirmed, what would be your goals and strategies to think about addressing Iran as an adversary?
You asked that question at a very interesting moment. So Iran today, 2 points I want to make about Iran, and it's really important. When we talk about Iran, I'm talking about the radical Shia clerics and not the people. The people of Iran are people of an ancient civilization, an ancient culture with tremendous pride and advances. And I don't know who take great pride in their Persian heritage and identity. And I don't know of any nation on earth in which there is a bigger difference between the people and those who govern them than what exists in Iran. And that's a fact that needs to be made repeatedly. In no way is the clerics who run that country representative of the people of that country and of its history and of contributions it's made to humanity. And it's a point I wish we would continue to make. Iran and that regime is at its weakest point in recent memory, maybe ever. Their air defenses have been badly damaged. Their Shia crescent that they were trying to create has been badly damaged in Lebanon, in Syria, where they've been basically forced and driven out. Their economy is in shambles. They now are on some days having 6, 8, 12, 9-hour blackouts. They are on the verge of potentially, if not having done so already, having to pull back on the energy subsidies that they provide people in that country that are incredibly popular, and it would be unpopular to reverse. So they're in a lot of trouble. And now what we need to be wise about is the following. I imagine that within that regime, and I'm just saying this because of common sense, there are two schools of thought. There's one group that's saying now is the time where we need to find ourselves an off-ramp. Not going to turn into really nice guys, but we're really in trouble here. We need to find an off-ramp and buy ourselves some time. And then there's another group that's probably saying now is the time to prove that we are a nuclear power or nuclear capable power, enriched from 60 to 90 and press go. And that's how we're going to buy ourselves immunity from foreign action. And this is a tenuous moment in that regard, but it's one we need to acknowledge. My view of it is that we should be open to any arrangement that allows us to have safety and stability in the region, but one in which we're clear-eyed. Any concessions we make to the Iranian regime, we should anticipate that they will use, as they have used in the past, to build their weapon systems and to try to restart their sponsorship of Hezbollah and other related entities around the region, because they seek to become the dominant regional power. That's their stated goal, and it's been clear by the actions that they've taken. I think it is interesting that in a year in which I think by October of this year, the Europeans and the E3 countries of the UK, France, and Germany have to confront whether they're going to do the snapback provisions or not, because Iran is clearly in violation of the agreement that we're no longer a part of. In fact, IAEA inspectors have not even been in the country since 2021, if I'm correct. So I think early this week on Monday, they engaged the Europeans in talking about nuclear arrangements. So whether that's indicative of the direction they're going on that, we're going to find out. What cannot be allowed under any circumstances is a nuclear-armed Iran. What cannot be allowed under any circumstances is an Iran and an Iranian regime that has the resources and the capability to restart and continue their sponsorship of terrorism. And what cannot be allowed under any circumstances is an Iran with the military capability of threatening and destabilizing its neighbors and potentially reaching the homeland as well, both kinetically and directly, and also through their surrogate groups who have long planned contingencies for attacks. And let us not forget that this is a group, these are individuals that have spent the last 5 years actively and openly plotting the assassination of the president-elect and of multiple members of previous administrations. Think about this for a moment. When is the last time you heard that a foreign government is actively, openly, and admittedly seeking to assassinate the former Secretary of State, the former and soon to be once again President of the United States, and others? And that people have been arrested for plotting that. This is who we're dealing with. And anything that we do with Iran needs to be clear-eyed about who that regime is, but also who the people of Iran really are, and because they're not their leaders.
Marco, thank you. Shortly after the election and prior to Thanksgiving, I took a quick trip over to Central Asia. As I discussed that with you a bit, to Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. In fact, in the last 12 months, I visited all 5 of the Central Asian countries. In fact, I was bedded down, speaking of Iran, 20 miles from the Iranian border in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. They have the 4th largest reserves of natural gas in the world. But this is a part of the world that is often neglected, but of such strategic importance. You've got Iran, you've got Afghanistan, Russia, and certainly China, as they talk about living in a submarine, as they look at multi-vector diplomacy, want to engage with the United States as the Russians and Chinese are competing for their favor. One of the first trips that I made after the election, the reason was Central Asia. There'd not been a U.S. senator there in 13 years. 13 years to Turkmenistan or Tajikistan. Very important strategically. One of the first goals of the caucus that Senator Gary Peters and I created of Central Asia is to repeal the Jackson-Vanik label on the region and extend permanent normal trade relations with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I realize you have a lot of priorities on your plate when you will be confirmed as our secretary, but I would say rescinding it would be a good faith indication of the Jackson-Vanik requirements that Central Asia needs right now to grow. My question is, would you work with me and Senator Peters to have your team work with us to remove this designation?
Yeah, and I believe the permanent removal will require legislative action. I don't think Senator Murphy has a bill on that as well. Yours is 3 countries. Look, I think this is a relic of an era that's passed. There are some that argue that we should use it as leverage for human rights concessions or leverage to get them to go stronger in our way as opposed to Russia and the like. But I think in some cases it's an absurd relic of the past. I think it's Kazakhstan, who the Department of Commerce has already said is a market economy. In fact, I think they hosted the WTO ministerial just a couple of years ago. So it's just they've met the conditions.
Yeah, it's something.
So we will work with you on this because I think it's important.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's a neglected part of the world. I look forward to working with Senator Murphy on this. You know, that C5+1, which is Central Asian countries plus the United States. Hope we can work with President Trump actually to think about maybe hosting some kind of a summit there. Very strategic. After the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we need more friends in Central Asia, and look forward to working with you on that. In the time I have left, when I open up my comments, talked about all these conflicts around the world, sometimes we forget some of the most important relationships are right in our backyard, thinking about Mexico. With the nearshoring going on at the moment, a lot of production coming now into more of our time zone and hemisphere coming from China and so forth. Laredo, Texas is now the largest port in the United States. I think it's one of the underreported facts in our country. You talked about the cartels. They have command and control, certainly on the border at the moment. My question is, you think about Mexico, and you've been so active on Latin America and looking south of the United States. With President Sheinbaum now just coming in office, what are your thoughts around how do we become better engaged with Mexico to help them with their issue as it relates to the cartels, basically, which are running the country, it seems at times?
Well, and I wish we had more than 30 seconds to do it because it's one of those issues that I think don't get enough attention beyond the problems. Look, Mexico's economy in many ways is a very vibrant one and has made tremendous advances and continues to be a very strong regional power. They can become frustrating at times for us because they have enshrined even in their constitution, a sort of non-aligned, non-interventionist foreign policy with regards to some of the abuses. And so it's been disappointing, for example, to see the position they've taken with regards to Venezuela and others. By the same token, our economic interests are so deeply intertwined. I think there are 3 areas of friction. The first is on trade and violations of trade agreements and so forth that have been laid out, and some of the things that I've seen, even as a senator from Florida in the agricultural sector, that are going to continue to be an irritant in our relationship that we hope we can resolve. The second is the security situation at the border. And I think there's great interest and should be on the part of the Mexicans to bring this migratory problem at the border under control. People forget an increasing number of cases. The people crossing the border are not Mexican nationals. They are people that are transiting through Mexico. And in fact, in southern Mexico, you have seen a significant uptick in resentment against migration by Mexicans who are bearing the brunt of the costs of becoming a key element of the migratory path. And the third is the violence. And this violence at our border has to be addressed. I think they pose a threat to the United States, most certainly. The flooding us with fentanyl, the criminal activities occurring within the United States, facilitated by these groups who have become vertically integrated. These are not the Colombian cartels. These transnational groups are now vertically integrated. They are the suppliers all the way down to the street level and all the way up to the production level. They are vertically integrated criminal enterprises, but they are also threatening the sovereignty and security of the Mexican state. And as I pointed, there are journalists and there are politicians who have been assassinated for standing up to these cartels. And it tells you the amount of leverage so they have over the government as a result of it. So it is in their interest as well as ours that we work cooperatively to take these groups apart and not allow them to continue the reign of terror, not just in the border region of Mexico, but spilling over into the United States.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank you very much for the edification of the committee. I've just been advised that there's been a ceasefire announced in Gaza. Before we all celebrate, though, obviously we're all going to want to see how that executes. With that, Senator Murphy, you're up, and then we're going to take that short break.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That is indeed good news. Senator Rubio, I want to talk to you about a topic that I think is going to be real trouble for you and for U.S. national security interests, at least for the first few minutes of my time, and that's the growing personal financial entanglement of President Trump, his family, and Middle East governments. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. For nearly 8 years, the Trump organization has been pursuing a real estate deal to build a hotel complex in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. During President Trump's first term, the Trump organization actually voluntarily committed to refrain from pursuing real estate deals with foreign companies, especially those that are backed by foreign governments. And so the deal didn't go through. And then it remained stalled for the entirety of the Biden administration. And then magically, 30 days after the November election, Saudi Arabia's biggest construction company that's affiliated with the government announced that the deal was going forward alongside an additional $200 million deal for a Trump property in Oman. Now, it used to be that somebody with these big financial business interests would come into government and take actions like setting up a blind trust or divestment in order to make sure there was no connection between their personal financial interests and the business they were conducting in government. But President Trump has just done the opposite, right? Over the last 8 years, while he was in office and since he's been out of office, he and his family have become more deeply dependent on revenue from governments in the Middle East. During his last presidency, Middle East interests sent about $10 million to Trump properties. After he left office, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was his primary Middle East envoy, was handed $2 billion in investment by the Saudis, even though a Saudi investment board said the investment was a bad business decision. That investment actually comes up for renewal in 2026, giving the Saudis massive leverage over the Trump family. And then to make matters worse, right after the election, the Trump organization said that in this term, the president-elect's second term, it would drop its previous prohibition on doing new deals in the Middle East with private foreign companies aligned with foreign governments. So the Trump organization is going to be signing new business deals in the Middle East with private companies that have connections to foreign governments at the very moment that you are going to be conducting sensitive diplomacy in these countries. That's just extraordinary. Never before in the history of this country has a president been, literally receiving cash from foreign governments and from foreign companies that are backed by foreign governments in the middle of their term. If you or I had done this as senators, we would be in violent violation of Senate ethics rules. That's not permitted on the Foreign Relations Committee. And so I guess my question to you is a pretty simple one. Do you see how this fundamentally compromises your diplomatic efforts? Do you have an issue, or will you raise an issue with the president about his growing financial connection with the governments that you're going to be negotiating with?
Well, first of all, I am not neither authorized nor in any position to give you sort of any insights into any of these arrangements you've pointed out. You mentioned Jared Kushner as an example. He's a private citizen, happens to be a Floridian. I don't know what, if any, engagement he has in the work that's going on now. I can tell you what I know. Obviously, I'm not in the State Department yet, but I can tell you as an example, the president's envoy to that region, who was charged, Steve Witkoff, who was charged with being an envoy towards reaching an accommodation between the Israelis and the Saudis, has been working cooperatively and together with the Biden administration. And in fact, I dare to say that all involved deserve credit for the ceasefire that the chairman's just announced. But Steve Witkoff's been a critical component of it, and he has been involved in it from day one. I think the broader consideration about whether we want to see a Saudi-Israeli mutual recognition and relationship would be one of the most historic developments in the history of the region for all the factors we've discussed here today. It would be, and one of the impediments to it has been this conflict and the ongoing conflict and the lack of a ceasefire. I also think it's going to be important for the Saudis and others to be participants in post-conflict stabilization efforts in Gaza and beyond. So all I can tell you is that what I've said from the very beginning, from the opening statement, and that is our foreign policy is going to be driven, as the President's made abundantly clear, by whether some action makes America is in the interest of the United States and our national security. And that's what it's going to be driven by. And that's how all these policies should be judged by. And that's certainly the job that I believe I've been tasked with executing on.
Well, let me then simply ask you this question. Do you believe that the president should refrain from doing new business deals with Middle East governments during his term in office?
Well, my understanding, again, I'm speaking out of turn, but the president doesn't manage that company. His family members do, and they have a right to be in the business. I mean, that's the business that they're in. They're in the real estate business. They've been for a very long time, both domestically and abroad. They have properties in multiple countries. So at the end of the day, I don't know, his family is entitled to continue to operate their business. The fundamental question is not whether his family is involved in business. The fundamental question is whether that is in any way impacting the conduct of our foreign policy in a way that's counter to our national interest. And the president's made abundantly clear that every decision he makes and every decision we are to make at the State Department should be driven by whether or not it serves the core national interests of the United States. And that's how I hope our policies will be judged by, not what business his family is conducting while the president is here in Washington working not on his business, but from the Oval Office.
You are correct. That is the fundamental question, whether or not a policy is being pursued in U.S. national security interests or due to the president's personal financial interests. That is the reason why, as United States senators, we are not allowed to have complicated existing financial arrangements with foreign governments, because you do not want to create the impression that there is a conflict of motivation. And I just wished that this president applied to this incoming administration the same rules that we hold ourselves to as United States senators. Senator Rubio, in the time I have remaining, just want to tackle two other topics. One that I know is of mutual concern to you and I, and that's the need to confront China in non-military ways as they try to exert influence around the world. Last time President Trump was in office, he was calling for pretty massive cuts to the State Department's budget. But as you know, China uses all sorts of non-kinetic tools like disinformation, economic diplomacy around the world to exert influence. I'm hopeful that you're going to be an active voice to try to make sure that you have the tools, including when it comes to combating Russian and Chinese misinformation, to be able to confront all of the ways, many of them asymmetric, that China in particular, but Russia as well, presents challenges to U.S. interests. Just wanted to get your commitment to make sure to build that full, comprehensive foreign policy toolkit.
Yeah, not only have I been someone concerned about foreign disinformation, I've been the target of it from multiple nation states. And I've learned over time that the best way to confront disinformation is through a flood of free speech that allows the counterpoints of view to be heard and understood. I think where we get ourselves into trouble, and we've learned this now, and I think multiple US companies are now admitting, is when we get ourselves into a position of determining what's true and what's not, and then using the tools of government to go after that, particularly when it implicates domestic entities. But yes, it is one of the tools that they have in their toolbox. By the way, it's not just disinformation. It's flat out influencing nation states' views of the United States writ large by promoting conspiracy theories internally in other countries that undermine us and that undermine our standing, whether it's in Africa, and increasingly you see it in the Western Hemisphere as well. And one of the best ways to combat that is to be present, to be there, to show what we do, and to brag about what we do. One of the things that frustrates me the most is there are literally programs within the USAID where they do not allow us to label it as made in America or a gift of the American people because it might offend someone locally. I think it's important for the world to know that what the United States is doing to help their societies, we do not do a good enough job of promoting what we have done historically and continue to do to help our fellow man around the world.
Yeah, China is spending $10 billion per year on that propaganda and misinformation operation. They celebrate when budgets get sent up to the Hill that propose big increases in military spending and giant decreases in the kind of tools that are available to you. So I do look forward to working with you to make sure that we've given you that full suite of tools necessary to confront our adversaries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. We'll take this break now. I appreciate everyone getting back here in 5 minutes because we've still got a long ways to go. And so with that, we'll be at ease for 5 minutes. Committee will come to order. We will continue on with our 10-minute rounds of questions. And by my list, the next person up is Senator Barrasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, congratulations. I'm grateful for your willingness to serve our nation in this new role. Thank you as well for your family's commitment to continue with your service here to this country. I think President Trump made a wonderful choice in nominating you to be Secretary of State. Your extensive foreign policy experience and your deep understanding of international
Committee will come to
relations,
order.
I think, makes you a perfect choice for the position. While serving together in the Senate
We
on
will
this committee,
continue on with
I've seen
our 10-minute
firsthand your
rounds of,
dedication, your knowledge,
questions.
and your
And
commitment
by my
to our
list,
nation's
the next
security.
person up is
Your
Senator
strategic
Barrasso.
insights,
thanks so much,
your
Mr.
principled
Chairman.
approach to
Senator Rubio,
diplomacy,
congratulations. I'm
You're
grateful
going to
for
serve
your
our
willingness
nation
to
well.
serve
We
our
do face
nation in this
many
new
challenges.
role.
We've
Thank you.
talked
as well,
about them in the past.
for
You have my full and unwavering continue with your
support.
service here.
We're going to start with
China. I
China.
think President
Because
Trump
over the
made a
years, we
wonderful
worked
choice
closely
in nominating
together
you
to
be
counter the
Secretary of
significant
State.
threat that
Your
China
extensive
poses to
foreign
global
policy
security
experience and
and
deep
stability.
understanding of
Chinese
international
Communist
relations
Party
I think
strategy
makes you a
extends
perfect
far
choice for the
beyond
position.
traditional
While serving
military
together in the Senate
conflict.
on this committee,
You're conducting an
I've seen
aggressive
firsthand
campaign
your
aimed at
dedication, your
weakening
knowledge,
American leadership
and your commitment
and
to
reshaping
our
the
nation's
global
security.
order to serve
Your
their own
strategic
interests.
insights, your
You're gonna make
principled
no
approach
mistake,
to China
China
is
is
challenging our
diplomacy.
interests
They're
all
gonna serve
across
our nation
various
well, and we
domains,
do face
diplomatic,
many
economic,
challenges.
technological. Talked about them in the
They're
past,
playing
so
the
you
long
have my
game,
full and unwavering support.
I think we have to respond.
I wanted to start with
equal
China,
resolve
because over
and
the
the
years we
strategy.
worked closely together
It's
to
essential
counter
that
the
we fully
significant threat that China
recognize
poses to
the
global
scope of the
security
challenge
and to stability.
and develop a strategy to
Communist Party
safeguard
strategy
American
extends
interests
far beyond
values on the world
traditional
stage.
military
Could you talk a
conflict.
little bit about your
You're conducting
approach
an
in
aggressive
addressing an
campaign aimed
increasingly
at
weakening
aggressive
American
China
leadership
and how
and
we
reshaping the
and our
global
international
order
partners
to serve
hold
their own
China
interests accountable?
We make no
Well,
mistake,
as
China is
I,
challenging our
pointed
interests
to
all
earlier,
across
it's an important question because I
various
think it's
domains,
definitional to the
diplomatic,
century.
economic,
I really do. I think
technological.
the 21st century
They're
will be
playing the
defined
long
by what
game.
happens between
And
the United States
I
and
think we
China.
have to respond with
The Chinese have
equal
basically
resolve
concluded that
and the
America
strategy.
is sort of a
It's essential
tired,
that we fully
great power in decline,
recognize the
that
scope of
they are
the
on a
challenge
path over the next
and
20 or
develop
30
a
years to
strategy to
naturally
safeguard
supplant us,
American interests
irrespective of what
and values
happens.
on the world
And I think their
stage.
preference is
So
to
could you
not have
talk a little
any
bit about
trade
your approach in
and/or
addressing
armed
an
conflict in the
increasingly
interim, because I think
aggressive
they might
China
interrupt
and how
what they
we
believe is a
and our
natural
international
progression.
partners
I don't share
hold
that view. I
China
think they have some
accountable?
significant domestic challenges. And as I nonetheless pointed to, I do think what we can ignore. Important question because I think it's definitional at the current road that we're on right now. The 21st century will be defined by what happens. Much of their growth and their progress has come. The Chinese have basically concluded that America is sort of because they frankly have violated the rules, power in decline, that they've benefited from, but have lived they are on a path over the next 20 or 30 years. So I think the first begins with the recognition that China is and will continue to be a rich and I think their preference is to not have any trade. It's in the interest of global conflict in the interim that we have interrupt to what they believe is a by the same token, we cannot find ourselves in a significant domestic challenge. We allow them to continue to fly. I do think what we can ignore in order to undermine that economic current road that we're on right now is an unbalanced. Nor can we allow them to undermine much of our alliances, progress, and our presence in different parts of the world. Not because they outcompete. I think it is clear because they frankly have violated on that path towards that they benefited from, but have lived by none of its world's preeminent power. So I think the first begins with the recognition that China is and will continue to be a rich and that has historical ramifications because it's in the interest of global underpinnings because they view these smaller countries as tributaries. By the same token, we cannot find ourselves in a situation to Beijing in which we allow them to continue to. Unfortunately for them, their neighbors do not view themselves as tributaries economically and or industrially. And nor can we allow them particularly true in places like South Korea, Japan, and our presence in different parts of the world. So, for example, I think it is clear that on that path towards what they view as their rightful place as the world's preeminent power. They want to establish at the core of our strategy has to be twofold. Number one, and that has historical ramifications, geopolitical balance, historical underpinnings in China, because to avoid they view any sort of smaller countries as tributaries, deeply destabilizing and worse for the world. Roads lead, but at the same time, ensuring and they view that it doesn't come at our expense. Unfortunately for them, we don't find ourselves in a world in which we are dependent on China. Or any foreign power. This is particularly true in places like South Korea, the raw materials that we need for the ability to make Vietnam and others, for the ability to fuel our economy, the ability to feed ourselves or our people. Disagreements. We cannot be a country that becomes dependent. So at the core of our strategy has to be twofold. Number one, ensuring not simply how we engage in the world, but also balance between the United States and China. That is not the responsibility of the Department of State. Any sort of conflict that can be deeply destabilizing. Much of what's happened with China, much of what's happening now, ensuring is what we are not doing. Come at our expense. That we don't find ourselves in a world in which we are dependent or access to or any foreign power, minerals, and raw resources, the raw materials that we need for the ability to make medicine economy, for the ability to
You talk
fuel our
about
economy, the
China playing by a
ability to
different
feed
set of
ourselves and
rules,
our
and they
people.
do the ones that
We cannot be a country that
traditional
becomes
rules. But
dependent on
and I
foreign
appreciate
powers.
your
And so
comments
much of that
to Senator Ricketts about
involves
China
not
and
simply how we
even the
engage in the world,
definition
but
of them
also
as
what we do here
developing nation.
domestically.
I think
That
it's
is
a
not the
big
responsibility
problem.
of the Department
They
of
can't
State.
be allowed
But
to
it's important for us
continue to
point
play
to
openly
that much
with
of
a
what's
different set
happened
of
with
rules in
China, much
addition
of
to
what's
the hidden
happening
rules.
now,
I oppose
what we
China
are not doing,
exploiting its status
whether
as a
it's,
quote
through
developing
our own
nation
industry and the
within
development of our
international
industries,
organizations.
or
I
access
think
to
it
raw
helps them gain
minerals
an
and
additional
raw
unfair
resources
advantage
that are
in what you
critical to
described as
fueling
this
and/or
unbalanced
building a modern
relationship.
economy.
China is not
You
in
talk
any
about
way a
China
developing
playing by a
country.
different set of
You
rules,
just
and they
mentioned
do
they're
the
a rich
ones
and
that
powerful country. That's not a
traditional rules.
developing
But you all-
country.
and
It's
I
the second
appreciate your
largest
comments,
economy in the world.
to Senator
Clearly
Ricketts
has the
about
financial
China and
resources and
even the
access to capital
definition
to
of
meet
them
its
as
own
developing
needs.
nation.
So I think
it's
we
a
need
big
to end
problem.
China's
They can't be
preferential
allowed to
treatment
continue
and
to
hold
play
it accountable on
openly
the
with a different
global
set of
stage.
rules.
I
I
mean,
mean,
we
we
see
see
it in the
hidden
World Bank.
rules, see it in other
I oppose
locations.
China
Are there things that
exploiting
we
its
can do or
status
you
as
can
a
do as
quote
Secretary of
developing
State
nation
to try to
within
eliminate
international
this unfair
organizations.
advantage that they
I
have?
think
It's an
it
open
helps
unfair
them
advantage.
gain an
Yeah,
additional
absolutely. I think we
unfair
need to, first of
advantage
all,
in what
and
you
I
described
mentioned
as
this
this
in my opening
unbalanced
statement, we have to acknowledge
relationship.
that many of the
China is
global
not in any way a
institutions
developing
that were
country.
created not
You
just in
just
the
mentioned they're a
post-war
rich
era,
and
but
powerful country. That's
post-Cold
not a
War era have been
developing country.
weaponized
It's the
against
second
us.
largest
And I can
economy in
use
the
a number
world.
of examples.
Clearly
The
has the
first is,
financial resources
think
and
about
access to
the
capital to meet its own needs.
Security Council of the
So I
United
think we
Nations,
need
which
to
was
end
created ostensibly for the purpose of preventing global conflict. Sadly, two of the greatest drivers of instability in the world today hold a veto vote at the Security Council. It's basically rendered the Security Council almost irrelevant. By the same token, I would say I am not against multilateral organizations so long as that or any foreign arrangement we have serves the national interest of the United States. I do not believe, and the president has made this abundantly clear, President Trump, that under no circumstances should any foreign entity or multilateral or international organization have veto power over the national security interests of the United States of America. The second point that I would point to is that the Chinese have very aggressively played this. They have figured out, and it isn't hard to figure out, that even the smallest nation state has a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. And they have worked hard to not just court, but entrap a handful of votes around the world, and including in our own hemisphere. If you look at the Caribbean basin, in Grenada and places like that, where they go into these countries, and they don't just provide $1 million to $1 billion to build the state. They also give you $5 or $6 million under the table for your family and friends. They do that in place after place. We've seen that practice as well in Africa. So we need to understand that there has to be, in many of these parts of the world, look, we're not bribing anybody. We're not going to do that. And it's certainly illegal for American companies to do it. But it's hard to engage these countries who in many cases have legitimate needs when they say, the Chinese, we prefer to have your stuff. We prefer to have American investment, but you're not offering any. And so we're left with the only alternative, and that is to take the Chinese investment, even though it comes with strong strings attached that include things like debt diplomacy or debt traps and expectations of diplomatic cooperation at these international forums.
Great. My final question has to do, because you used the phrase, we need to be able to fuel our economy, and I'll talk a little bit about energy. Look, people who live in poor and developing nations, they want to be able to fuel their economy as well. They need a stable energy source to grow their economy, to improve lives. Many of the countries you've traveled to and I have, we've seen what energy poverty can do to people to make it harder for them. You know, we have an ability to help these countries develop a stable energy supply. But this current administration, the Biden administration, has put restrictions in place on funding of certain energy resources, such as coal, even natural gas. The United States should be working to promote an all-of-the-above energy strategy and help our friends and allies have affordable energy, as opposed to what is the politically correct type of energy to be used. So I believe we should be helping these countries with energy. And are you committed to ensuring the State Department is promoting all forms of energy projects across the globe, including oil, gas, coal, affordable energy that will help people raise their standards of living?
Yes, in fact, it should be a centerpiece. One of our centerpieces of our economic diplomacy. We talked earlier, I think it was Senator Coons had mentioned the work on fragile states and the hope of preventing fragility so that states don't collapse into some of the havens that you now see where terrorism takes a hold and so forth. And one of the things you can do to help a country become more stable and then more prosperous is access to reliable and affordable energy. And that is that's not simply for everyday life. That is critical if you want to build a manufacturing sector. It's going to be especially critical in a world in which all these new technologies like AI are going to require a tremendous amount of power generation that's going to draw upon global energy resources to begin with. So absolutely, it needs to be at the centerpiece, and we'll work very closely with the Energy Department in ensuring that it's a centerpiece of our foreign policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And next up, we have Senator Booker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Marco, Senator Rubio, the president made a great decision in choosing you. I'm happy to see you there. You're a thought leader in foreign policy. I, however, don't think most Americans know how great of a thought leader you are in NCAA, NFL, and high school football. And I'm a little disappointed that you're not going to be the head of the NCAA right now.
Not yet.
We sat in my office recently. I told you about my concerns about Africa right now. Democratic Republican administrations have not prioritized the continent. It is literally the fastest growing continent on Earth. We now see the future. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 human beings on the planet will be in the continent of Africa. And because of the demographic issues we have around the globe, from Europe to the United States to even China, 1 out of every 3 working people on the planet will be in Africa. It is rich with arable land and critical minerals. It has an economic potential that could create tremendous markets for American companies and American businesses. More than this, we know while it has incredible assets and opportunities, a lack of focus on Africa can endanger the whole planet. We know in the days of infectious diseases, for example, an outbreak of an infectious disease anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. More than that, we see the climate challenges, migration patterns there threaten to destabilize the Middle East and other areas. Egypt, for example, literally is hosting millions of refugees in Egypt right now. Now, my frustrations in my 12 years here is that we as a nation have not really prioritized it. We do not have ambassadors in some countries where China and Russia, who understand the African opportunities, are investing heavily. I've gone around the world, and in my times in African countries, I often encounter people that saying, hey, the Chinese are here, where are you? And it's not just ambassadorial placements. Other critical positions in embassies just aren't being filled. And therefore, we're being outplayed by the Chinese and the Russians. African countries and leaders have told me time and time again, we prefer you. We'd rather deal with you. We'd rather work with you. And we can see by legal immigration patterns that their people would rather our way of life than the Chinese or the Russians. But we are simply being outplayed in ways that we can counter if we had a real focus and a real strategy for engaging Africa. And the impact of U.S. engagement is real. And the backbone of our diplomacy is that diplomat abroad, is that Secretary of State on down, people saying this is a priority. I said this to you in our office, and I want to make it plain now that we are at a point in this country that what we do in the Senate and in the White House and in the State Department are planting seeds for the future. We could reap a tremendous harvest in 10, 20 years, prioritizing and emphasizing our work in Africa. And not to do so undermines the 3 points that you said at the beginning that I agree. Our foreign policy should be guided by what makes us safe, strong, and prosperous. And the future in so many ways is Africa. Could you just talk to me a little bit about how you are prioritizing it, how you understand the critical opportunities and the dangers of not engaging at a higher level than either the Biden administration, Trump administration, Clinton administration, Bush administration have done?
Yeah, and I'll preface it by saying that obviously I'm not been confirmed yet. The president's not in office yet. There will be a national security strategy. That will frame much of what we do in foreign policy. So what I'm going to share with you basically here today is, as someone who will be at that table, some of the impressions that I would share with regards to our historic involvement in Africa and also some of our challenges moving forward. So the first, and you've already highlighted all the things about the growth that's going to happen. They'll double in population between now and 2020, 35 or what have you. So it's extraordinary. That isn't just an interesting number. That's also markets. Those are also consumers. Those are also places that I think provide an extraordinary opportunity, properly positioned for America to become more prosperous. Literally, more people that can afford to buy the things Americans provide, both in services and goods, and vice versa. So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity. Where I think some of our situation in Africa has fallen off it's been, and rightfully so, heavily focused on counterterrorism and solely on counterterrorism in some places. And that's valuable and important. It is very difficult for a country to progress or move forward if they are in fact a haven, for that's open. And so, the freaks come out at night and you've got the terrorist groups that are operating and undermining that country. So it's not that it's unimportant. I think we're also learning from the Sahel how quickly the situation changes despite significant counterterrorism contributions. Each of those countries have pivoted to their great mistake, grave error, towards the Africa Corps led by Russia. These people are not any good at fighting counterterrorism and unreliable. And I think the moment will come when they'll realize that, and maybe there will be a new opportunity to engage. On the flip side of it, if you look at littoral West Africa, there are real opportunities there for, and in fact, ongoing engagements, not just on counterterrorism, but on economic progress. I look in the north to Morocco, another place where we have already seen substantial improvements because of the accords, but also because phase 2 of that relationship that continues to build. You also talk about one thing that I don't think has been talked about enough, and I think we hear the term as a 19th century term. The impact that malaria has is not simply a health crisis or humanitarian crisis. It has deep economic crisis. Deep economic implications. It pulls kids out of school for long periods of time and not end their lives. It literally sets people and communities back. Humans and people are the greatest resource of any country. And the cost benefit of an investment, leveraging private partnerships to deal with things like malaria, pays extraordinary dividends if appropriately done and channeled. And that is something that I think could, as part of an overall approach to Africa, be included in things that you could argue are improving our prosperity, our security.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. You've affirmed a lot of this to me in our private talks. I just want to make an emphasis publicly here that the disinformation in Africa, and you've mentioned disinformation writ large, but, for example, the Washington Post published an article in October detailing how Russian propagandists targeted U.S. anti-malaria programs in Burkina Faso. The Africa Center for Strategic Studies published in March 2024 highlighted how Russia and China are leading sponsors of disinformation campaigns in Africa that are showing incredible success because we aren't doing a coordinated campaign to counter their misinformation. And so I'm looking forward to working with you. I hope that you'll prioritize this for the sake of America's future, that you could be the Secretary of State that says we have a vision for Africa and we're backing it up, not just from the Secretary of State's office, but all the way down to making sure key resources